Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. I'm Peter Ndoro. Thanks for joining us. Here's what we're going to be taking a look at on the show today. We'll be unpacking how critical the media can be in helping maintain peace during election periods. We'll also take a look at the trending topics on social media and what's inside our Sunday newspapers. And we'll also be taking a look at Donald Trump's recent attack on the media. Nothing new, I guess. That's what he does. Fake news, fake news. Anyway, before we engage with our panel for all of that, let's take a look at one of the front pages of our Sunday papers. And we start with the Sunday Times, which is leading with a story on how prized cows worth millions of rands bought with public money and meant to benefit emerging Eastern Cape farmers were instead dished out to former President Jacob Zuma, ANC politicians and Eastern Cape royalty. The City Press, well, that's running with a story about how the SABC's unpaid bills at the end of July are believed to exceed 100 million rand. And this is owed to 64 companies, with independent TV producers owed 90 million rand of that. The Sunday Independent is carrying a story about the new commander of the Hawks, Colonel Nkosinathi Nomvalo, who has a criminal conviction and is expected to start his new job at the Hawks head office in Durban tomorrow. Nomvalo will oversee, amongst others, the serious and violent crimes, narcotics, fraud and human trafficking and political violence units. In KwaZulu-Natal, the Sunday Tribune is leading with a story on how the DA has stopped supporting Black Economic Empowerment (BEE) policy. Parliament has slammed the opposition party for its position after the party's highest decision-making body, the Federal Council, dumped it because they say it's not working. Well, the Weekend Argus, that's leading with a story about how pressure is mounting for the Minister of Higher Education, Naledi Pandor, to fire the Chief Executive of the National Students Financial Aid Scheme, NSFAS, and disband its board following the ongoing allegations in dispersing money for students who were promised free education. Crossing our borders to Eswatini, Sunday Observer there is leading with a story about how Citadel Investments, trading as Awesome Security Services, stands to lose 1.3 million elangeni after allegedly presenting a fraudulent labour compliance certificate. And in West Africa, Nigeria's Daily Trust is carrying a story about how business activities were paralyzed in Sokoto State yesterday after a huge crowd took to the streets to welcome Senator Alhaji Wamako, the leader of the All Progressive Congress in that state. All right, so that's what's on the front pages of our Sunday newspapers, but we'll take a look at those stories and the ones inside a little bit later on. And helping me to do that, well, we've got, as usual, a couple of guests that I invite into the studio who are going to apply their great minds to help me, and I want to introduce them straight away. And good to have you back on the program, Professor Ilva Rodney Gumede from the University of Johannesburg, and somebody who joined me in Zimbabwe covering perhaps one of the biggest stories in the country for a long, long time, Busi Chimombe, who's acting political editor, SABC Radio. To both of you, welcome. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, we'll unpack all of those stories and more, but let's start with that much anticipated Zimbabwe elections, which were marred by violent protests and action by the state security forces. Supporters of the opposition MDC took to the streets of Bulawayo decrying preliminary results, which saw ZANU-PF's Emerson Mnangagwa in the lead. Deadly clashes broke out in Zimbabwe after the country went to the polls in its historic first election since the fall of Robert Mugabe in November. A report released by Bulawayo 24 says that media was pivotal in conflict situations to promote peace. The African Peace Building Network, APN, leading to the Zim elections, gathered different scholars and journalists from the continent at the Namibia University of Science and Technology, NUST, to discuss how journalists can be peace builders and use their writing skills to douse conflict situations. Let's take a look at this story.
Well, it's here where the violence began, clashes between police and MDC Alliance members and supporters who were aggrieved by the National Assembly results, which saw ZANU-PF maintaining a 2/3 majority, while police blamed the official opposition and its leadership, but singled out Tendai Biti. Biti was then scheduled to hand himself over to police. But hours later, Biti claimed he was no longer a wanted man after talks with police.
The lawyers went to the law and order section of the police at Harare Central, where they were advised that we were not required, and should we be required, the lawyers will be notified.
But police have disputed this.
We have not spoken to him. We still want to talk to him.
International observers have also condemned the violence by the opposition and use of excessive force by the state.
The army is brought in as a last resort when law and order have completely broken down and the police is unable to handle the situation. In most cases, the police are trained to be able to handle riots like this. And so when the army comes in, then sometimes tragic incidents like what happened happen.
Crisalda Lewis, SABC News in Harare, Zimbabwe.
All right, so a bit of background there in terms of what journalists and media can do to unpack this and the role of journalists. Perhaps let me start with you, Wusi, because you were there on the ground, and it was fascinating looking at the media. So in the run-up to the elections, they said that it was largely peaceful and it was calm and there was not much tension. And I just wonder, from your gut feeling, what role the media can play in calming people ahead of polls?
Well, Peter, I think it's very important. I mean, for the first time in these elections, we saw the media actually coming into Zimbabwe. In the last elections, 2013, 2018, we've seen a former Robert Mugabe regime being quite unhappy about media coming in. So this was the first time we had a lot of international media coming in. I think just from that perspective, it has the effect of actually just calming the situation, because the security forces, the intelligence operatives, everybody kind of knows that the country is under the spotlight. So I think you see people on their best behavior. So just by their mere presence, I think journalists and the media do have a calming effect.
And I suppose the journalists have a responsibility as well with what they write, because that can influence.
No, absolutely, and here we need to differ between the Zimbabwe media itself, inside the country, and then outside reporting. It's been interesting to just, observe also differences maybe between the more, the SADC community reporting vis-a-vis then Western reporting. And of course, the Western spotlight, particularly the European media and the British media, of course, is on this story. The US media don't really take an interest in the Zimbabwean elections, but I think there are certain differences here. Firstly, and I think Wusi is absolutely right when she points out, there's been a spotlight on Zimbabwe which changes dynamics. So you can't get away with murder in that sense, quite literally. But also the coverage has been quite, inside the country, as you mentioned earlier as well, Peter, has been quite pitted. We had the state media versus the private-owned media that also, supports different fractions. And that's a danger in and of itself. We haven't seen that with the outside reporting. I think the outside reporting has actually highlighted that there's been problems and vote rigging, etc., etc.
All right, we'll talk about Zimbabwe a little bit more, but in general, because I'm thinking back to 1994, Rwanda, genocide, and the media played a critical role in fomenting the violence and the genocide. So we can't underpin the words that are written and how they're written, how they're poised. Talk to me about that, both of you, your thoughts. As journalists, when you're writing, is it something that you're mindful of, that, what I'm writing, could it cause a problem, even though it might sometimes be factual? Yeah.
Well, I suppose it depends which media organizations you write for. Obviously, the tenets of accurate, fair and balanced reporting are very important to make sure that you look at. But the issue is, for instance, a public broadcaster, I feel, has got much more of a responsibility in terms of what it actually does right in terms of some of these particularly volatile situations, making sure that in the end, you don't have a situation where the sensationalism of the story is pitted against actually what it is that you're trying to actually say. So I think, as somebody who works for the public broadcaster, it's always very important to try and make sure that the sensation of the story is not made too much.
Ilva?
No, absolutely. You're absolutely correct in what you say. And I think that it's interesting then. A public broadcaster has as its, very sole mandate is to, provide a broader context, make sure that all voices are included. I mean, that's good journalism in a sense. I think that what we stand the risk of is always this idea that we actually often highlight official sources, elite sources if you wish, and it's easy then to lock into, as we have seen in the Zimbabwean elections, particularly coverage inside the country, that you back one candidate, and then someone else backs another candidate. Even if we don't do that, in coverage from outside the country as well, what we see is that we highlight these two candidates that get pitted against each other. And it becomes body politics as well. So here we have Mnangagwa on the one side and we have Chamisa on the other. And whether we structure that as a forces of good and bad or, whatever we do, we overemphasize this polarization instead of looking at the broader picture and including more sources as well, and particularly sources on the ground. So if we are going to talk about Zimbabwean elections and rigging, and we need to interview the people who went to the polls. Those are the ones who can tell us something.
All right, so
that's important.
So what I want to do now is, because we see you were inside Zimbabwe during particularly that last week, and Ilva, you were outside, and I just wonder how both of you experienced the Zimbabwean elections, you being outside looking in based on the media that you were exposed to, and you being inside and picking up the papers every single day. Let me start with you, Busi. What sense did you get about the reporting as someone who was consuming media inside the country?
Well, I find it very interesting that at the point at which the results of the elections were coming through, and when the protests were taking place just after the results of the National Assembly elections, and at some point I did manage to go to SABC, and they were actually showing a movie at the time. So all the images of the protests and the violence, they basically did not record. If you needed to see that, you needed to see it on the international networks. But I also just wanted to follow up on what it is that you had said previously about the fact that it's important to get all the different sources. The difference in Zimbabwe this time was the fact that for the first time we were actually able to get official sources. One of the problems about reporting in Zimbabwe for the before was that you would always get the voices of the street, you'd always get the voices of the opposition, always very willing to speak, but it was always difficult to get the official voice. So to an extent, that's quite problematic in the sense that you do kind of need, and even if it's a rebuttal, even if it's a denial, but you do need some kind of official source to actually balance out your story. And in the absence of that, it's very easy to get for speculation to come in, and for all sorts of perhaps not so accurate facts to come through. So that's always been the difficulty. I think in Zimbabwe it's not so much the fact that for some of the media who have tried to be impartial, it's not so much the fact that they were deliberately misrepresenting the facts. It really just was a case that they really could never get the officials to actually talk to them. All
right. Ilva, I'm going to get your response right after this, because we have to take a quick break, and when we come back we'll continue taking a look at Zimbabwe and perhaps some of the challenges that journalists faced, and as Busi pointed out. Stay with us.
SABC News celebrates Women's Month. we are losing the best of kids. People that fathers or pastors that comes from a church.
No taxi, nothing. We were not notified. I get to town, there's nothing.
Sihleli nje nathi nana njengabahlali balana and then nje masihleli lapho siyazathi nje sinamajita ngale sibona ismoke siyaqhamuka phezulu.
It's ridiculous because we don't have money.
Now I have to spend more on paraffin than I used to.
Their shacks were dismantled on Monday, but they are back to erect them.
You know what gives an African person dignity? It's only a house. And our bank, it's sheep and cattle. So we want to restore our dignity as well.
News at 9. We go beyond the headlines of the day and breaking news to bring you all the angles and in-depth analysis of stories that impact your life. We are on the ball with all economic stories. Our bureaus around the globe are ready to connect you to events as and when they happen. So join us every day at 9 to zoom in on the day's big stories.
Right, welcome back. We continue with our focus on the Zimbabwe election conversation and take a look at what the newspapers in Zimbabwe have been saying. Let's take you on a little bit of the journey ahead of that.
Yes, Taban. Yes. No, wait, I know what I'm here for. Okay. Don't worry, Taban. Where is the policeman, the head of the police?
No, he's left. But these people are still here, they're threatening journalists.
No.
What in the name of
God? No, please! Cannot deliver my message. Cannot deliver my message. Now, I'm told there's a... Hello?
Ambassador. Wait. Why are you sending police to disrupt our process?
Why are you sending? No. I'm asking you a question.
Why are you sending?
What do you think I've come here for? Deliver my message. My message is clear. Nobody can stop a press conference. Yes, let's go then. All of you should go, journalists, to have your press conference.
Yeah, that's what we say.
Nobody is being stopped, and I'm saying the police must go.
Yeah, the police must go.
Stop this press conference.
All right, just to give you a bit of background as to how that played out. Now, Ambassador Kayamoya used to be the Zimbabwean ambassador to South Africa, but he's a senior ZANU-PF official and was at the forefront of their election campaigning. So the opposition party held a press conference soon after the results of the constituencies were announced. And the police came and stopped, literally, as this press conference got underway, stopped the press conference, forced the journalist out, and then a little bit later on, I think senior people in government saw what was playing out on international media, and Ambassador Kayamoya then was sent to send the police away. The police eventually issued an apology saying, look, we had intelligence that suggested that this was a political gathering, and after having checked the credentials of the journalists, we realized it was a press conference, and the press conference was then allowed to go ahead. So that's the background to that. And what it speaks to, ladies, is the challenges that journalists face, because the automatic response for the police was to go and shut it down. And it's clear perhaps that messages were being a bit lost in terms of what the presidency, senior government officials wanted and what the police and the army may have been trained to do. Your quick take on that. Let's start with you,
No, I think it's, it's it's a prime example of how badly, you handle the media, hey? And I think it's an after construction that you thought this was a political gathering, hey? The media handled the situation really well. So firstly was this idea of waiting for the press conference. We're not going to run ahead of ourselves. We wait for the official results to be released in one way or the other, and the best way to do it is to wait for that press conference. I believe that also election results were actually released at 12 o'clock at midnight or something like that, which is also sort of trying to control and manage it in one way or the other. But of course, what coverage do you think you're going to get when you handle the media so badly and everyone is ushered out? And we can see from the footage here that people are trying to capture this on cell phones, etc., etc. And of course, it just gives that chaotic image of the elections as a whole.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah. Your sense?
Well, it was really quite confusing on the ground because it just seemed as if they were not quite sure how it is that they were going to treat us. Yeah. So this was a prime example. What was shown now, a prime example. You see a presidency and a government basically with open messaging about the fact that oh, you're welcome, everything is fine, etc., etc. And then you have situations like this taking place. So the question is it just a patchy media strategy? Is it a question of old habits die young, as you mentioned, die hard, as you mentioned, where people who have the police, the military, who have been used to this sort of thing, this is the mode that they actually go into. But another question would be, perhaps who really is in charge? Is it really a situation where there is a coherent government strategy in terms of the media, or do you have two places from where the different messages are coming from?
Yeah.
It was remarkable to see the police issue an apology. I mean, that is unheard of in Zimbabwe, where they say sorry for the inconvenience caused. But again, I think what it does talk to me about as well is the challenges of being a media practitioner in the country. And we're going to start showing sort of front pages of the newspapers now. And what was interesting for me is that as you look at these headlines and these pages, you can tell straight away which one is state-owned and which one is private-owned. And I kind of half feel sorry for the ones that work for the state media, because they have to stay on message no matter what. So it is a challenge when you're in a country where the regime or the government of the day, particularly during Mugabe's era, forces the state media to behave in a certain way. Your thoughts about the challenges that reporters, particularly working for public media, face?
I mean, it's difficult, and but on the other hand, the ceiling is only as high as you make it. And I mean, it comes at huge risk, of course, for journalists when they try to push those boundaries, and it's difficult to do so. However, we also need to factor in what happens on social media. And that's, there's a space in between these two sort of, state versus private media and Zim, for example. And what the social media does then is trying to capture that broader debate within the country. And I think that many journalists actually working even for state media take to social media and has a different function there and fulfill a different role. But I do think that it's also, to a huge extent, a lot of self-censorship when you work under these conditions, whether you're aware of it or not.
Yeah. Lucy?
Well, from the perspective of the different media, the private state media, look, I don't think that's necessarily a problem, as long as you actually have space for different messages. There must be a diversity, and it's fine if you know, okay, this is a paper that is that endorses MDC Alliance, this is a paper ZANU-PF. You can read both papers and you can make your own mind. I think that is more critical than every single paper trying to actually get the right balance. That will never happen.
Okay. So my fear again is the headlines, and this is where the media must be careful. So we saw just one headline here where it says MDC unleashes violence. Here we've got one that says nasty bid to discredit polls, and this is the Patriot. Essentially, they've picked a side, isn't it? And so if you are neutral, you wake up MDC accountable for violence. soldiers shot people in the back. Yes, the MDC, some of their supporters were very violent. So the media also must be responsible, even if it is private.
Absolutely, and I think that, I mean, we just saw those, you said, pointed out the headline of the Patriot there. It is one thing when you look at, I mean, and this is a blatant example. You mentioned the genocide in Rwanda, which is, you know, has been highlighted again and again as this example how the media can instigate violence. I think a headline such as this on the Patriot, and many of the other papers that we saw, you know, is a direct incitement to violence in a sense. Here we have a media that's not doing its job, whether it can do it, forced to do these kind of things or not. It's a very, very dangerous situation. However, often it's much more subtle. So if you look at media outside of the country, we see a little bit of these narratives as well. It's very easy to look into, once again, you know, pitting one against the other. And I think that we saw very early on headlines and coverage talking to then, you know, how Chamisa was already contested. You know, he was contested elections before people have even gone to the polls. He said, this is going to be rigged, we're going to fight it. Whether he used that kind of narrative or those exact words or not, that was actually the coverage even outside of the country. And there is a danger there, because I think what we need to factor in here as well is what we get as an audience. So it's not only, we can have this discussion as journalists or media scholars, for example, but it's what the audiences pick up on. And if the audience is led to believe that there's only violence, there's no other way of looking at these elections, then we're already predisposed of thinking about elections results in one way. And that's really, really sad. We think that there's no other way out.
So we'll see, again, you know, you've got a country like America, you've got Fox News, you've got CNN and so on and so forth, and they're private media and they push their agendas, but somehow people kind of know and they're able to make up their minds. Are our democracies still fragile, that we can't allow that sort of full blast kind of approach that the Americas of this world are, or are we ready to just face any headlines with our democracies as they are?
You know, as you were saying, we can have this media discussion, but you know, when you talk to, and I'll talk about Zimbabwe specifically, when you talk to the ordinary Zimbabwean on the street, you have a very highly politicized, and not only highly politicized, but also a populace who, over the last 20 years, have watched politics very, very closely. There's very little that the ordinary Zimbabwean misses in terms of the facts that they're given. You know, they do take a side, they obviously have a position, but they're very well aware of what it is the other side is saying. So as much as we have a responsibility as the media, I think we mustn't undermine the ordinary person. And you did mention the fact that social media also has come into that space a little bit dangerously, in the sense that perhaps some of these things are not verified. But I think we mustn't undermine certain populations. In Zimbabwe, for instance, I think they are ready for those headlines and can distinguish between truth and fiction.
All right, you know, we can discuss this till the cows come home, because it is just such a fascinating thing to observe. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll find out what's been trending on social media. Dare we? I'm nervous.
Everyone wants a dignified funeral.
That is what a clientele funeral plan can give you. Lasting dignity.
I just want my family to be there, all relaxed, not worrying about paying for anything, knowing that clientele covered everything.
I would like a dignified funeral, and the rest should be invested for my children's future.
Clientele funeral plans pay out in 24 hours. We will even send 200 Rand airtime. You can cover up to 13 people on one plan. Plans include grocery, unveiling, and transport benefit. Plus, you can get all your premiums back.
I told my family, I don't want a fancy funeral. They must come there for a cook sister and a sandwich, and then they must use the rest of the money for their future.
I will never stop paying my monthly premium.
To me, paying my monthly premium is as important as buying groceries.
SMS LIFE to 31043 and we'll call you back.
SABC News celebrates Women's Month.
Right, welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor. Let's take a look now at what's been trending on social media this past week. And this package has been prepared for us by the SABC Digital News Division.
Welcome to this week's Social Media Wrap. Coming up, SABC Digital News attended the public debate on fake news, algorithms and you, hosted at the Goethe Institute in Johannesburg. We talk to an expert on why you should care about algorithms and how it affects you in your daily life. But first, let's look at the major trends of the week. Conversation surrounding the Zimbabwe elections has dominated social media channels. We speak to social media expert Tanya Kuri on The Reach.
On the 1st of August, we saw the Zimbabwe elections peak when it came to the amount of traffic on social media. 7 days before the 1st of August, there were 80,000 unique returns about the Zimbabwe election. And literally, overnight on the 1st of August, the peak became 342,000 people saying something about the Zimbabwe election with an incredible reach. The story has turned out bitter, with two particular camps, the Mnangagwa camp and the Chimiswa camp. Those are the biggest conversations. And then, of course, the violence we saw break out, and that the army has now been sent in. Those particular stories are big peaks over the 1st and 2nd of August.
Thousands of women marched across South Africa on Wednesday to demand an end to violence against women. The marches are in response to a large number of women, children and LGBTIQ+ people who are abused or killed by men in South Africa. President Cyril Ramaphosa announced on Tuesday that through a parliamentary process, they would finalize the proposed amendment to the Constitution that would outline the conditions under which land could be expropriated without compensation.
As the SABC, we follow a mandate to give you, the public, a voice. So now it's time to have a look at what you've liked the most this past week.
The top story on sabcnews.com, as liked by users, is Mnangagwa winning the Zimbabwe election. Close on its heels, users were very interested in the suicide of Professor Mayosi, the taxi shooting where 11 people lost their lives, and the news of demolishing houses in White River also brought traffic to our website. And finally, South Africans were over the moon with the lunar eclipse. Algorithms are widely used throughout all areas of information technology and daily life. Did you know that algorithms or computerized decisions can have an impact on your credit rating or even medical diagnosis? We caught up with Matthias Spielkamp, founder and executive director of Algorithm Watch at the Goethe Institute. Spielkamp explains that we need to look at these computerized decisions very closely, but that transparency is key in the companies and platforms which employ these systems.
Now more and more platforms play a big role. Intermediaries, YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, they curate news. That's the expression that they usually use. That means they select this, they aggregate news, and they present them in a specific way that is personalized to each and every user. Now, this can be manipulative. And I'm not saying that, for example, Facebook is actually trying to manipulate the sentiment in South Africa or the public discourse. I'm saying it can happen. It can happen for, because of mistakes are being made or because of some bad modeling that is employed.
For the full story on algorithms and fake news, head over to our website www.sabcnews.com. We all know that Mzansi has no chill. It's now time for the lighter side of what you've been tweeting. With the Gautrain strike and fuel price hike, users on Twitter did not disappoint with their humor.
That's it for your social media wrap. For SABC News in Johannesburg, I'm Nina Westhuizen.
Okay, so that was social media. It wasn't too dramatic in terms of fear factor, but interesting. And thanks very much to our SABC digital news team for putting that together. All right, let's take a look and see what's been happening on the front pages and inside the Sunday papers. And once again, I have Ilva and Wusi taking us through that. So let me start with you, Ilva. What grabbed your attention?
So the Sunday Independent has a big story on saying, the headline says Mongani Mayosi, and I think that story is hugely important, and it's sad beyond anything. And looking at media coverage as well, I was one of the first people, I think, that said when I heard the story, you've got to be very careful when you talk about a suicide and thinking that you know the reasons behind why someone, takes their own life. I think here we have actually some proof, in a sense, from the family itself, saying that actually it was the fire that he came under during the Feast Must Fall movement, and he was called names. Huge pressures then from the medical fraternity as well. And he was fortified, where he felt that in the end transformation didn't happen, and this is exactly what was highlighted then by Roads Must Fall, the Feast Must Fall movement as well. And it's just it talks to broader issues in our society around racism, lack of transformation, and I think also the other side of the story here, and that's being highlighted inside the Sunday Independent as well, and some of the other newspapers as well, is the pressures that the medical fraternity is under as well, and working conditions that are horrendous, working hours in particular that are horrendous.
Yeah,
so
there were some alarming statistics actually about the number of medical practitioners that find that suicide's the only way out. I mean, it's
horrendous.
All right, we'll see what grabbed your attention.
On the Sunday Times page 4, I saw the story Northwest Rebels using ANC as cover. I thought it was quite interesting because there's been ongoing speculation after the former President Jacob Zuma stepped down in terms of what are his kind of political aspirations from here and what happens to his allies. Now this story actually speaks to some of that. Apparently in this story, an ally of Suprama Humapilo, who was seen to be very close to Jacob Zuma, was trying to recruit Thandi Mutise's nephew. Now, how true this is not really the issue. I think the issue is really about the continuing interest people have in terms of what happens to people who who were not seen as pro-Cyril Ramaphosa before Nasrec. What happens to them? Is there a place for them? Do they find themselves outside the ANC? The ANC? Are they trying to mobilize in such a way that they actually have some kind of political base of their own? We've heard that they're trying. There's a party called the African Transformation Congress that is trying to, push for the former president to come back to politics. But I think this is going to be one of those stories that is going to continue. I think what is important about this one is how high profile Suprama Humapilo is.
And I guess as we approach an election cycle, the African National Congress is trying, and its mantra is unity. These kinds of stories doesn't help them with that journey. How do they change that narrative? I mean, if on the one hand they're sort of standing up and singing these songs, and then every Sunday there seems to be some story of division.
Yes and no, because I also think it's quite interesting that we haven't seen that much coverage on the Zuma trial, for example. And I think that the party has been very careful in not highlighting that. So we could have a scenario, or maybe we'll go into that scenario the closer we get to the elections. But as you say, I think that the party is very careful here now of actually trying to display some sort of unity and from different narrative altogether. And I think that's quite interesting.
All right. Okay. So you another story that piqued your interest.
Yes, I think that there's a story that also links a little bit to the Mayosi story, and that is NEPSAS. And as a university lecturer and a professor at the university, I think this is hugely important. It's a big story. We know that these funds have been mismanaged. They haven't been paid out in time. There's been other problems as well. And we see now that Naledi Pandor, the minister, is trying to deal with NEFSAS. And whether she will be able to do so, whether it comes too late, is a different question altogether. But we're going into, the last part of the year, we're going into next year. These are the students that are going to enter university. Some new, some existing stories. And, if we don't manage this carefully, we have masses of students out there. They've been promised free education. They've been promised these bursaries. What are they going to do? And let's pray that we can manage that well.
And President Zuma, that was his last parting shot, wasn't it?
Yes,
just before Nasrec.
Yes.
He set this cat amongst the pigeons. And so now they have to manage it.
Yes.
No, it's absolutely important. And I think it's one of those issues, together with the issue of land expropriation that we've seen coming to the fore. That is going to be one of the major issues that people are going to be looking at ahead of the 2019 election. So there's a lot of pressure to get it right.
Yes.
Also on the front page of the City Press, and it's our beloved SABC, public broadcaster, and it's a challenge for the public broadcaster to be able to do its work going through such financial strain.
Yes, something very close to our hearts, clearly. The story talking about the fact that the SABC has 100 million in unpaid bills, and blaming this, of course, on the former COO, Hlaudi Motsoeneng, and mostly on his 90% local music, particularly for radio policy. Of course, Mr. Motsoeneng coming out and saying, no, of course not, that is not the case. But the issue is the impact of it. I mean, as ordinary, we have seen the media industry is shrinking. We've seen what has happened to ANN7, to what's happened to Afro Voice. I think a lot of us who are working in this media fraternity are quite anxious in terms of that. And when you see an organization like the SABC, which has been quite stable for the longest time, the public broadcaster almost on its knees, it becomes it's actually very worrying.
All right, we're going to have to take a quick break, and when we come back, Donald Trump is in sharp focus. He hates the media. Let's take a look after this.
So TB continues to be the top infectious killer worldwide, claiming 4,500 lives a day. It is estimated that approximately 1% of the global population is autistic. So if you're on a medical aid, how well do you understand the benefit structure and how your medical aid generally works? And if you're not on a medical aid, have you considered belonging to one? So how much and what should you know about this condition? Is it curable? Can people living with epilepsy, for instance, play sport, drive cars, get employed? 7 million people around the world die annually as a result of tobacco use.
For Health Tip, catch Health Talk every Saturday from 9 to 10.
SABC News celebrates Women's Month.
Right, welcome back. Now you're watching Media Monitor, and now we focus our attention on US President Donald Trump, who ramped up his relentless condemnation of the media on Thursday night, criticizing the press as fake, disgusting news, describing journalists in attendance as horrible, horrendous people. And this is despite UN experts warning earlier in the day that Trump's actions were putting journalists at risk of being violently attacked.
There has never been, and even these people back here, these horrible, horrendous people, even these people back there, look at it. It looks like the Academy Awards. There's so many. You ever see this? Is this the Academy Awards you're doing? Even these people, they say, probably in the history of this country, maybe in the history of the world, there has never been anything like what happened in November of 16. Probably never. Probably never happened. Probably never happened. But they can make anything bad because they are the fake, disgusting news.
All right, so Donald Trump, he is what he is and he does what he does. Ilva, can he get away with that for much longer? Because I think initially it was cute, it was fun, but there are, as the UN experts are saying, there are real dangers to his kind of chat now.
Well, I don't think he was particularly, never cute, never fun. But I mean, it's an interesting choice of words there. He's saying fake. I mean, you know, in a sense, he's been the inventor of fake news. I mean, his whole campaign was, you know, literally won on the basis of fake news, eh? And fake news from particular sources that he has quoted as well, hey? So we know the Russian involvement there. So I think it's really interesting that, you know, when he suits his own purposes, he's saying fake, you know. But beyond that, it's a dangerous situation. When you then attack journalists in this blatant way and saying, he's pointing and he's saying, you despicable, horrendous people, hey? And it provides for something. And I think that also we saw attacks on journalists during his presidential campaign as well, where actually journalists who were too critical were locked out of venues, they were attacked, they were shouted at, and I think we even had instances where his own family was involved with, you know. So it's really, it's a dangerous situation, and it sends out particular messages. Whether he can get away with it or not is an interesting question. I think that the latest thing that's sort of come out of the White House press corps as well is where then we've seen a standoff between the White House press officer Sarah Sanders and the CNN and journalist Acosta. I think that this he could have taken on too much here, because CNN is still a force to be reckoned with internationally as well. So I don't think he's going to necessarily get away with it, and how far this goes, and if people do take him seriously, yeah, we'll see.
I mean, this kind of, we've seen it this week with President Mnangagwa, where he has been issuing tweets and kind of trying to pull back from some of the things that have been happening in the press. He was quite presidential, as opposed to this man who's the media that can help him with his agenda. He's turning on it. It's remarkable.
What I find very interesting is the fact that, you know, when Trump does this sort of thing, the narrative almost is that, you know, okay, he's crazy, he's like a lone wolf president, etc., etc. And yet you don't expect this kind of attack on the media to happen in an established democracy. If it were to happen anywhere else, for instance, as in Zimbabwe or anywhere else, and you had a president who was behaving like that, the narrative would be quite different. It would have far bigger ramifications. It would be about the country. It would be about how you know, the investors are. You know, it would be a wider thing about a regime that has gone rogue, as opposed to here in this case. It's just a man who's perhaps not particularly pleasant. So I think that's quite interesting.
Is there some truth in some of the things that he says? Could some media be, you know, because we know that media can take sides.
It's a good question. I mean, he's getting a lot of flack for the media, you know, and as he points out, you know, this is a man that's actually being labelled crazy, and, you know, we highlight he's not very articulate and so on. But I do think that, you know, I mean, you also, you know, reap what you sow in a sense, that it's very difficult not to highlight these kind of things. We've seen the same coverage around Robert Mugabe, for example. It's been, you know, then you've highlighted different contexts and so on, which has been, but you know, and the media is very, you know, also political parties, when they don't get the coverage that they get, or presidential, you know, candidates or public officials, they're very quick to say, you know, I'm getting unfair coverage. You know, but on the other hand, you're very quick also, you need the media coverage. So it's a fine balance.
All right, okay, we're running out of time. 30 seconds. Anything that you think we should be looking out for in the week ahead, Busi?
Well, it is, I think they said it was at the end of August, where yesterday was the last hearings of for Parliament's Committee on Land Expropriation. So it will be interesting what comes out of that. Of course, we're not expecting anything immediately, but I think that is definitely something that we're actually going to need to watch.
Ilva?
Zim, of course,
Yes.
you know, will there be a rerun? What happens in the Constitutional Court? Can Chamisa, you know, challenge the results? That's a big story. We must not forget as well that it's Women's Month.
Yeah.
And I was very humbled. I listened to Sophie de Bruyn-Williams the other day as one of the women who participated in the Women's March. It's humbling, and we have challenges, gender-based violence. You know, those are things that we need to highlight and continuously do throughout the month.
To both of you, thanks very much indeed for guiding us through all of this stuff. Thank you so much indeed for your insights. And for you at home, thanks so much for tuning in. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you at the same time next week for more of the same. Bye-bye.